West Virginia. It's a place of tight-knit communities and hardworking people. It's a place where hospitality, love, and support are lived out daily. West Virginia is near the top of the list for charitable giving, military service, for volunteerism. We are number one in the amount of time we spend with our neighbors. It's no wonder that pride for our mountain state runs so deep. Pride runs deep for the more than 250,000 children in the West Virginia school system. We tell where we're from, using our county name. We keep going to high school sporting events long after our kids have graduated. Public schools are the biggest institution in our state and one of the biggest employers. For many kids, it's the first community they know outside their family. Each one of the 657 public schools creates a community home, and the 34,000 school personnel who work there make those communities thrive. West Virginia, nestled in the mountains, fed by her soil and streams, is a place full of contradictions. Her very landscape protects you and can isolate you. Over 26,000 of those 250,000 students know that isolation all too well. They will be a victim of child sexual abuse before their 18th birthday. That's right. 1 in 10 of our West Virginia kids will experience something many of us find unimaginable. Something that some of us know all too well. School personnel are on the front lines for protecting children. The first step connecting them to the help they need after they have experienced abuse. Standing at the ready for that call are child advocates, doctors, CPS workers, and many others forming a team of professionals to accompany that child on their path to hope and healing. West Virginia. It's a place I call home, and I've called it home since the day I was born, screaming with the joy to be alive. Crystal, Dawn, Good. Almost heaven, they call it, but for me, as many West Virginians, it's complicated. West Virginia is a place I love. It's the very place I've learned to be a writer, a mother, an advocate. But it's also the place I endured years of sexual abuse by my stepfather. Years that would go unnoticed by adults I was reaching out to for help. My story is its own. It spans from 1974 to today. But it is familiar, and my behaviors might even be called textbook signs of child abuse. Drawing pictures at 5 that no 5-year-old should have known to draw. Running away as a teenager, dealing with addiction as an adult. I managed my pain for a long time with anger, lots of anger. And I also had a quest for justice. I got it, in a way. My perpetrator went to jail, and he admitted his crimes. He even apologized. But I wanted justice for more than me. Justice for the thousands of West Virginia kids who are reaching out for help in their own way, from their own stories. So I went to the Capitol and shared my story in front of rooms of lawmakers, advocating for the passage of Aaron Marin's law. They listened, they acted. Today, in classrooms all across West Virginia, kids will receive body safety education, the kind of education that could have created space for me to disclose what was happening at home. And school personnel are receiving training so that they know what to do with those disclosures and how to prevent abuse before it occurs. I've done a lot of healing over the last few years. I've been through transformative, trauma-specific counseling. I found healthy coping skills. My healing took some time, some mental health services, and lots of faith. I know that I cannot change my past, but I can help others with my story. And the most important people to help are the helpers. I wanted to go on a quest to understand what actually happens when someone in the school system suspects and reports abuse today. What would happen to that little girl who, like me, reaches out for help today in the way that she knows how? So I traveled across the state to meet the real West Virginians who make up the child protection system, from the moment of disclosure to the courtroom. People like these have helped me change my life for the better. This journey is an opportunity to look back at my life and into the system. And maybe I'm being ambitious, but I believe if people know what to do, they will do even better. And that includes me. In my journey to see what happens when child sexual abuse is reported, I started at the very beginning with school personnel. That's when I met Brittany Keys Anderson, principal of Whitethorn Primary School in Mercer County. Brittany knows the critical role that school personnel play in the lives of kids of all ages, from the cook to the custodian, the math teacher to the music teacher, bus driver, security. School personnel are the eyes and ears of the community. They see the kids all day, every day. From the moment they board the bus to the hectic challenges of pickup at the end of the day. Principals like Brittany know they must rely on their staff to notice when a kid comes to school with bruises, or is uncharacteristically shy, or is just feeling off. I sat down with Brittany and two of her school personnel, Vonna, the lunch lady, and Crystal, the school social worker. We talked about how school personnel are often times those on the front line when it comes to recognizing the signs and symptoms of child sexual abuse and actually making the report.
I see the kids as they come through the lunch line. I look for more bruises, scratches, burns, because we are not really hands-on with the children like everyone else in the school, but the kids tell a lot. They tell a lot coming through the lunch line. Even our little lunch line is small, but you can tell if they're having a bad day or if they're crying. I always ask, where did you get that bruise? Where did you get your scratches? Did you have a bike wreck? And they will tell. For some reason, they love us, and they open up with us a little bit more, it seems like. But they touch my heart. Some of them are just really sad.
We see them every day. They are here usually more than they're at home during the week. So, we do build those relationships with them, and we're familiar to them. So we can tell when there's a difference in a child, and if something's going on, or injuries or something like that.
That is one of the biggest things that school personnel can do with kids, is to build a relationship. Yes, we have curriculum that we have to teach, but at the same time, we are teaching a child. And when you're looking at a student who was bubbly last year, but then they're coming in this year and they're really withdrawn, or we see aggressive behaviors or just a different tone in the child, there's something going on. Kids just do not change automatically like that. And so we try to be very keen as far as, okay, how are they responding, or how are they handling situations? Is their head always down? Are they looking away? Are they not smiling as much? And so just trying to pick up on all of those behaviors and being aware of what's going on, that's big, and that's important for school personnel.
So you identify change in behavior,
yes, absolutely.
And then you monitor that, and if you feel it's it's of great concern, then you take another step further and may make a report. And especially if a child discloses any abuse to you make a report. What is the next step?
If there is suspicion of abuse or neglect, they do need to make a report to the hotline. If they feel uncomfortable with that, I will sit with them while they make that phone call. But it's very important for the person that actually has firsthand knowledge of what's going on to be the call. That way they can provide details that I may not have. As you know, stories once they're passed along, details get lost. So the person that has that firsthand knowledge should be the one to call. But I don't mind to sit with them at all.
If it is something that we feel needs immediate attention. We are, of course, on the phone with my supervisor, making them aware. They are contacting law enforcement. But if it is something that I feel, and we've had a case like that here before, where it is unsafe for that child to go back home, then we are gathering all of our resources to get law enforcement, and then our social workers are definitely involved in that process as well, so we can get someone immediately out here to help them.
What happens after a report is made?
The school doesn't always know. We just have to give it over to Child Protective Services to complete their investigation. So that's something that we don't have that control over.
And that's for the protection of the investigation and the child, but that shouldn't hinder anybody from thinking that an investigation isn't happening.
Absolutely not. Anytime you suspect anything is going on, you should report it.
I think sexual abuse is another issue that our kids do face, and it is a more difficult topic. I work with kindergarten, first, and second grade students, so being able to verbalize what's taken place for them is very tough, and they do not know how to necessarily tell you what's going on other than try in the best way possible. Or we have had experiences where kids will touch another kid inappropriately because somebody did that to them, or they will mention inappropriate things with their genitals, and that's because someone else has done that to them, or they've seen that take place. And of course, we follow the same process as far as we are mandated reporters and calling the hotline for situations like that. But especially at this level, those are things that we notice, is that they show signs of sexual abuse by touching other kids inappropriately, and that's one of the first signs that is a question to us when we experience something like that.
I had a child that did not disclose that he had been sexually abused, but stated that his sisters were being sexually abused, and found out that the perpetrator was still living in the home. So we were able to get them intervention through his disclosure.
Because our kids do not necessarily know how to verbalize what's going on, journal writing and giving them the opportunity to draw pictures. We learn a lot about a kid by what they write and the pictures that they draw. And so we are able to, as we're reading journals or we're looking through things, I've had teachers bring me journals before, and they're like, "Are you reading the same thing that I am reading?" And immediately it's a red flag, and we have to address that.
I have to tell you, I was really excited to meet you all, because as a survivor, my abuse started when I was 5 years old. As you know, that's kindergarten. And the people that made the most difference in my life are my school principal, my counselor, and my lunch lady. I had to tell you, Miss Vonna, that my school cook, Mrs. Eggleston, made the difference in my life. That I, just being in this space and seeing your shirt, lunch ladies are magical, it's true. And so I'm excited, and just know how important it is to have this conversation with teachers and school personnel about what they bring to a child's life, especially when they suspect that there could be abuse. I just want to say how important your job is, and how special I think that all school personnel, teachers, but she really touched my life. So thank you all so much for sharing with me and letting me share too, but learn with you all. So I appreciate being here today with you. Thank you. Through my meeting with Brittany, Vonna, and Crystal, I learned that no matter which school or county you're in West Virginia, all reports of child abuse get routed to the same place for screening and processing before any action is taken. I headed to the call center that fields all reports, West Virginia DHHR Centralized Intake, to meet with Casey Springston and to get a better understanding of what goes on after a person files a report. I wondered, what does that screening process look like? Why would anyone screen out a report of child abuse? And who is on the other end of the line?
Yep. Yeah, so we have two centers, one in here and one in Marion County.
Okay. What happens here at Centralized Intake?
Okay. We receive all the intakes for child abuse and neglect, adult abuse and neglect reports for the entire state of West Virginia. We operate 365, 24 hours a day.
Wow.
We never close. Anytime that there's a need, we're available.
And there's a 1-800 number?
1-800-352-6513.
So when you call the 1-800 number, how much time can you expect to spend on the line with an intake worker?
15 to 20 minutes.
Okay.
You know, we would ask that they reserve at least that amount of time to make the report, just so that we can get all the important information to make an appropriate decision about the response time.
Okay.
We have an immediate response time for, you know, emergency situations where the child is in danger at that second. We have a 24-hour response time, which is generally when we have a vulnerable child, you know, which would generally is a child that's under 5, okay, that is unable to protect themselves. You know, we're talking like, or that they're with the maltreating parent or caregiver. So the time frames would be different based on that information. 72-hour, we also have that. Generally, that's if the child is older or with a protected caregiver that's able to protect themselves. Once the report is made, the reporter is only entitled to, and that is the mandated reporters are only entitled to certain information about so we can't tell them the ins and outs of what's going on in the case. So, you know, that's confidential to the family. All the workers that take the reports are licensed social workers, okay? So they have to have a 4-year degree, college degree, and be licensed through the state, okay? So that they know, they've all been trained on how to take these reports.
Casey, what are some of the reasons a case might not be passed on or make it out of centralized intake?
Child is over 18, okay, and there's no other children in the home. Abuse that occurs that are by people that are not a caregiver necessarily, you know. Sometimes when we get reports that are screened out, we look at behaviors of the kids. Sometimes sexual behaviors, maybe not related to abuse or neglect. So, I mean, it's okay for somebody to make the report, and that's why there is a screening process to determine if that's an appropriate response to the situation.
So what kind of people call in to the centralized intake?
The vast majority of our intakes are from school personnel, teachers, bus drivers, school guidance counselors, anybody that comes in contact with children routinely. We're regularly receiving those types of calls. The call numbers always go up when school starts. So, you know, teachers make up a large number of our day-to-day work.
The first line for a lot of children to be safe. Yeah. Casey really illuminated the reporting process for Child Protective Services for me. And he helped me understand what it takes for a case to move forward and to be assigned to a Child Protective Services worker. CPS is a tough job. I can't imagine the heartbreak of what a CPS worker encounters on a daily basis. In my life, I never had a Child Protective Service worker. But if I did, I would want that person to be just like Ivan Lee. Ivan is one of the most passionate, gifted, committed professionals I have ever met, and has dedicated his life to protecting the safety of children.
My name is Ivan Lee. I'm a Child Protective Service worker, and basically my assigned task as a Child Protective Service worker is the intake process. So it's my job to assess for safety once a referral has been assigned to me. And that process starts from centralized intake, the hotline, abuse and neglect hotline, and then once they get it, they take the report and they determine whether or not it's to be screened out or to be assigned. And usually, if they accept the referral, they will send it to a CPS supervisor.
Okay.
And from there, we have an assigning supervisor who assigns it to a worker,
Okay.
an intake worker, which
Okay.
does the initial safety assessment to determine whether or not there's been any abuse or neglect occurring in the home.
Okay. So I'm just going to be honest, because I know a lot of people give CPS workers a hard time, right? And I think it's because they don't see what's happening behind the scenes. Or they say, oh, they made a report, or this mom or dad or grandparent, they've had so many reports filed on them, and this and that, and I'm sure you've heard it. And can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sometimes we get those reports, and they're like, we've just been calling in these reports, and y'all aren't doing anything about it. We don't understand. Like, they've called in 4 times, and y'all went out 3 or 4 times, and they're still with the mom and dad. Well, it's our job to make sure that the children are safe and that they're being cared for and their basic needs are being met. This world that we live in, we can't expect everyone to be living some luxurious life and doing everything in the world, having them the best sneakers and all that. I mean, we live in West Virginia, and we're going through hard times and challenges in our state. And sometimes I think that is a problem for others that don't recognize that these children and these families have a unique background that they're trying to get out of this. So sometimes whenever we get out there and, they say, hey, the kids don't have no food at home, and they come to school dirty, and they don't have water at home to take a bath. I go out there, they've got a deep freezer full of food. They've got a refrigerator full of food. They've got water running. They've got bed. They've got clothes. They got a safe environment. There's nothing that would cause some issue for their safety. And sometimes these children, especially outside of the city, they play outside. We're a state for being outdoors, so they're going to get dirty, and they're children. So sometimes these kids come to school and they don't want to take a bath, or the mom's had a hard time with them. They're like, let's call CPS and tell, CPS to get involved, because these kids keep coming to school dirty, and they're hungry. I had one kid that's been coming to school, and I had a referral, and they kept saying he doesn't eat, he's hungry. And I get to the home, it's full of food, but it's just a kid that likes to eat. So he gets to school and he can only eat so much because of the limitation of the time. It's like he's at home and he's starving, but he's really not.
Right, and those reports, anyone that would pick up the phone and call the 1-800 number is a person that's caring, I believe, about the benefit of a child. But we all come from different backgrounds and have different lenses and perspectives and standards for parenting, and what I'm hearing from you is, sometimes, a child's basic needs can be met. Other people may have different standards, but from your lens, their basic needs are being met. But I do just have a little pause when it comes to teachers and school personnel making reports of sexual abuse, because, like you said, it can be so gray. So if a child is at school and exhibiting, sexual behaviors, or a teacher suspects something, how do you walk into a family or situation like that once the report's been made?
You got to remain professional. You have to be respectful. And you have to take almost like a soft but firm approach, because these are sensitive matters. You're literally getting ready to talk to a parent or guardian or relative about allegations of sexual abuse. And a lot of times, most times, and all times, nobody wants to talk about something like that. They don't want to be put on the spot. You think that I've sexually abused my daughter or my niece or my nephew? You got to be kidding me. These people are just like, oh no, there's no way, I didn't do that. But in reality, behind that person, it's really happened. But that child is so closed up. That's why we're going to have to get them interviewed. We're going to have to go get them to the Child Advocacy Center, have them interviewed, and then from there we can take it. But, talking to the parents in a more respectful and professional manner, and just letting them know that you're trying to do your job, is what I stand by, because a lot of times people respect that. They'll respect you if you show respect to them. And sometimes we get considered to be the bad people because we're Child Protective Services, and all we want to do is just come make people's lives miserable and take their children. Our number one job is to make sure children are safe and keep families together. Our job is not to go to homes and just take their children. So if we can make sure the child's safe and we can keep the children or child or children together with their family or parents, that's what we want to do. That's our ultimate goal. And if we have to put services in place to help them, then that's what we'll do.
Tell me about the good stuff.
The good stuff?
Yeah.
Well, my favorite part about the job is the face-to-face. I love speaking with people in person. I'm not a pick up the phone and just call you to check and make sure you're safe. Like, I want to go out there and I want to make sure the children are safe. There's not a place in West Virginia that I wouldn't go to make sure a child is safe. I've been in the woods. I've hiked up hills. I feel like I've gone around mountains to see and make sure these children are safe.
So, Ivan, I'm native West Virginian like yourself, and I hear it in the news. The local news, the national news, the whole country is talking about West Virginia's opiate crisis. And, you know, how does that play into your job, or what can you tell me about that?
Challenge. Steep challenge. I would say the number of referrals that we receive due to drug abuse by a caregiver or parent is skyrocketed. And when you think drugs, a lot of times people don't think Child Protective Services. They're ODing, they're using these drugs, they're making our community look bad. But a lot of times behind those drug users are children. So a lot of times we get referrals from schools or school personnel or people affiliated in the community with the school system, and they're like, hey, this parent's at home, they're using drugs. Calling CPS, we've heard that they're doing it. And sometimes the children will, disclose to us that their parent or relative or caregiver is using drugs. A lot of times what helps us in determining whether or not that parent is really using drugs is when they deliver a child. The mother is delivering a child and she's tested positive for some type of drug. Because right then and there, we have some type of evidence to work with, proof that that parent is using drugs, and they can't say, hey, we're not. But sometimes it's those ones that they're at home and they're using them, but we don't have the evidence to back it up. Someone said, hey, this parent is using these drugs and they're doing this and they're doing that. But unless you've seen it, unless a child's disclosed it, or unless we went in the home and we've observed, and I remind you, observe, because we are not allowed to just go in there like law enforcement and just search through people's stuff. We have to see it visibly. And if we don't see it visibly, if we don't see track marks on a mother or father or caregiver's arms or any type of drug paraphernalia, it's really difficult for us to determine whether or not that caregiver is using drugs.
That's helpful to know. I don't think a lot of people are aware. You're CPS, and that P doesn't stand for police, right?
Right. We are licensed social workers.
Right. Domestic violence in the home, and how is that being reported? And when you're out in the field, what do you hear and see about that? And how much of a problem is it?
Well, it's right there tied in with drugs. I mean, we get a lot of these referrals about domestic violence. And the thing when we go in the homes, it's like, you're looking for signs. You're looking for bruises. You're looking for marks. And a lot of times when you're having that one-on-one, and again, like I said, I enjoy the face-to-face aspect of this, because you got to build rapport with these children and these caregivers to determine whether or not there has been any abuse or neglect going on in the home, especially physical abuse. So when we get them, we go out there and we talk to the children, we talk to the caregivers, and we determine that. And sometimes, a lot of times, and the challenge we do get, there are, back to I said, third parties that give information and say, hey, this person's been getting beat up at home, they've been doing this and doing that. And we get out there, and sometimes there's no bruises, no marks on the children. They haven't disclosed to us that they've been abused. We can't know signs. And those are sometimes really hard to pin down and determine whether or not, unless someone's going to disclose or you see some visible marks, or you have a collateral, meaning someone that's a witness or can speak about the physical abuse going on in the home. Those are the tough ones to determine sometimes.
Ivan, thank you so much for talking with me. I'm so fortunate to be a part of this project that I think is quite impactful for school personnel and teachers to understand how we can keep our children, families, and our community safe and growing.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
I couldn't help but to think about my personal experiences when I spoke to Ivan. There were no child advocacy centers when I was growing up in West Virginia. I have heard about child advocacy centers, but I couldn't quite wrap my mind around the program and what it would have meant for me had it existed in the 1980s. So I went to Child Protect of Mercer County, one of the many child advocacy centers in West Virginia, to see what the model was all about. There, I met Shiloh Woodard, director of the CAC, along with her team. I spent the afternoon with them, and it struck me. This is the same amount of time a child might spend on their first visit to the center.
Here at Child Protect, we're Mercer County's nonprofit child advocacy center. Child advocacy centers here in West Virginia and also across the country are established really as community-based organizations that work to improve their community's response to child abuse. And so when kids come to visit us here, they're coming because there's been some sort of allegation or suspicion of abuse, neglect, maybe a child who's witnessed violence in their home or been exposed to drugs. And so typically we'll receive referrals from either law enforcement or Child Protective Services saying, we've received this referral and we need to find out from this child what they've been exposed to or what they've potentially experienced. And so what happens is then those children are referred over here to see us. And so typically when they arrive here at Child Protect, this is the first space that they come into. This is our waiting room for our families. We try to make our facility as child friendly and safe as possible. We don't want children to feel as if they're like heading into a police interrogation room.
Or they're in trouble.
Right, or they're in trouble, or they're like in a sterile sort of governmental office. So having a setup where it feels very familial and it obviously feels very child friendly is really important to us because we want to put kids at ease as soon as they arrive.
And what I'm going to see today is an example of all child advocacy centers, correct?
That's right. Child advocacy centers certainly look different across our state and also across the country. Some are actually housed in hospitals. Okay. Others are housed in courthouses or might be linked up with police departments. But the most common type of child advocacy center setting is the one like we have here, where we're sort of our own standalone building. Oftentimes child advocacy centers like ours are often in what used to be a residential home or what looks like a residential home. And again, the idea is to try to create an environment where children automatically connect with, oh, this is a place for me. This is a place where I can feel safe and I can feel at ease as much as possible with the circumstances that brings them here. So this is certainly just one representation of what a child advocacy center might look like in a community.
Okay.
So typically when a child and their protective caregivers arrive, the first thing we do is we just try to put them at ease. So letting them color, play with toys, read books, watch a movie, just so they automatically can sort of start to ease that feeling of tension. Sometimes families and children know why they're coming to the Child Advocacy Center. Other times, maybe a child has just disclosed at school earlier that day. The school's made a report to Child Protective Services or to law enforcement. Law enforcement makes the referral to us, and so the child might be arriving, at the end of the school day, and so it's literally been a really short turnaround from their disclosure to arriving here, and they may be a little confused about what's going to happen. So we do our best not only to put the child at ease, but also for us to sort of immediately meet with their caregiver and start to explain what's going to happen now that their child is here. They walk into this space, and as you can see, Crystal, we try to do everything we can to immediately put kids at ease and help them feel like this is a place for them. So when kids initially come to visit us, the first interaction that they'll have with us and our staff is for the forensic interview, and this is our forensic interview space. Again, we try to put children on the same level with those that are going to be interviewing them, and they're able to be in this space and just share their story, whether that's a story of, yes, something's happened to me and here's the details, or no, I haven't been exposed to violence or drug endangerment or abuse. It's the same process that we use in the same space. This is our team observation room. So whenever we talk with a child and conduct a forensic interview, we always have our investigative entities or professionals here to observe the interview. So law enforcement and child protective services, oftentimes other folks, attorneys, prosecutors, other advocates may be in this space to watch and hear the child while they talk with the forensic interviewer.
Okay.
And Crystal, here is our therapy wing at our Child Advocacy Center. So we have a separate waiting room area for children who are visiting us to receive counseling services. And then our therapy room is just here where children actually will come in and receive counseling from our therapist.
Thank you.
Crystal, here is our medical wing at our Child Advocacy Center. So for children who we feel like need a medical exam with our forensic medical examiner, but also to hear from a medical professional that regardless of what's happened to them, their body is okay.
Talking to kids about abuse isn't a task for just any person. How do you help kids feel safe when they may have had every reason to be scared? How do you make sure you're getting the most honest, forthcoming information about what they've experienced? Forensic interviewing, I've learned, is a field in its own right. There are committed individuals who make it their life's work to talk to children about the abuse they may have experienced. Lindsay Scott is one of those people. And she walked me through what it's like to be in a room, seated at kid level, and asking a child to trust you with their story.
This is where we conduct our forensic interviews. It's a child-friendly room. We have just some minimal decorations in the room, so it does look child-friendly, but we want to keep minimal distractions out of the room. So we do have these big fun chairs. They're usually what the kids are most excited about, and some paper markers to draw with if necessary. All of our interviews are watched by our team members, and they're also audio and visually recorded. Those are two really important components for our interviews. So we have team members, whether it be prosecutor's office, child protective services, law enforcement investigators, anybody that's involved on that case as far as investigators. They observe the interview because I may forget something. They may know something about the case that I don't, and they may need additional information. So towards the end of the interview, I step out of the room and see if there's any additional questions they may need answered, any additional detail.
What ages would you interview in this room?
We will typically interview 3 years and up. 3 is kind of the youngest. Anything younger than that is hard, and 3-year-olds are sometimes hard. Up to 18-year-olds, and every now and then we do interview adults with disabilities.
Children with disabilities, are they more vulnerable to child sexual abuse and abuse?
Absolutely. We see kids that have disabilities, whether it be a physical disability, a cognitive disability, it does make them more vulnerable. A lot of times it makes them harder to tell, whether it's a speech delay or a mental health delay, something of that sort cognitively. It makes it harder for them to disclose, and sometimes it makes it harder for adults to believe those children if they have disabilities. So our job here is to make sure that the child knows that they're safe and that they're believed.
Sexual abuse is such a sensitive topic, and I'm learning also that It doesn't matter if it's someone in your family, if it's not someone in your family, if it's age, if it's sexual orientation. And I'm also learning about child-on-child sexual abuse. Is this a place where that would be discussed? And can you tell me a little bit about that?
It is. It's something I feel like that maybe we see a little bit more with every year. We look at that as child-on-child, or it's also called youth with problematic sexual behaviors. We interview both the child that's been a victim in that role, and then also the child that has the problematic sexual behaviors. First of all, it's important to interview the child that was the victim, just to see what occurred, get them linked up to other resources, especially counseling if necessary. And then secondly, we interview the child that had the problematic behaviors, the problematic sexual behaviors, to see if there's been anything that's happened to that child that may have that's resulted in those behaviors. And if so, then we can link them to appropriate resources as well. One thing that we've learned as we work a little bit more with child-on-child abuse is that just because a child has sexual behaviors as a child, it doesn't mean that they're going to grow up to be an adult with such behaviors. So that's really one of those key components in getting them counseling and therapy services linked up when they're young.
This sounds like a tough job. Why do you do it?
I love kids. I think that's something that I hear pretty often. But I've always kind of felt like it is a tough job. Somebody has to do it. Somebody has to be an advocate for kids. And I feel like it's something I've always had a passion for, is working with children.
It meant so much to me to learn from Lindsay. I felt safe with her. And I can only imagine what it must mean for kids to feel that safety too, at a time when safety can mean everything. But I couldn't stop thinking about the families of these children. What about the people in their lives whose role it is to support? I'm a mother, and I know the profound pain I feel when one of my kids is having a hard time. So I can only imagine what a mother, a father, a grandparent must feel when they learn that their child has been sexually abused. Who is there to help them? At the Child Advocacy Center, that's Ladina and Sandra. And their years of work with families gives them a special insight into what a family might be experiencing. But it isn't just their knowledge that matters. It's the way they are with people, really with people. People who need someone to be with them and advocate on their behalf. So when a family meets with either of you, it's been determined that a child has been abused?
Not necessarily. We meet with the family as soon as they arrive at the center. The advocate will meet them at the door and take the non-offending caregiver basically in here and just assess what the caregiver has to say. So at that point, we don't know what's happened.
So it's parallel. When a child comes in, they have their root of things, but also any caregiver, a mother, a father, a grandmother, a custodian, they immediately, when they come in the door too, they start with services or any conversations that will help them understand the process.
That's correct. My role is to help assess what the needs of the family are. So the first thing I try to establish is some rapport, and the first thing I say to them is, I'm here to advocate for you. I'm your friend. I'm here to help you. We find that children with very supportive parents, and research backs this up, those parents are very supportive, who believe them, who believe in their children, those children have the best success in healing. I have also found that children who are survivors themselves, like you mentioned that earlier, those parents are often the hardest on themselves because they had tried to be so vigilant. They don't want to happen to their children what has happened to them. So with those parents, I work a lot with don't beat yourself up. It's not your fault either.
And being supportive, Sandy, it doesn't matter what your income level is or your education level. When someone believes in you, it's easier to pass that on.
Yes, and the children, the schools, we can't tell them anything about an individual case. We can tell them the process that a child would go through. We can talk about things like that, but we can also be supportive in supporting their caring. Sometimes I feel when they call me that it's a one-way street. They're giving me all this information. but I try to give them resources and reassurance that, these things are looked at monthly. And, the child, I can't disclose whether this particular child is in a process, but it is a process. So you may not see something immediately, teacher, but, hold on, because things take time. So but it's very good that they're supporting those kids and believing in them.
And it's good to know. I'm so happy to be here and to see what really goes on behind the scenes, because I think a lot of people don't have a clue of what actually happens once an initial report is made.
Right, they don't. I think, speaking with teachers in the past, like I said, they had concerns about calling it in and nothing was being done. And I think just explaining that process to them helps them understand why it's so important that they do keep calling, even if they feel something hasn't been done. Right. And I think that's encouraging.
And it's not the CPS, I'm learning, it's not the CPS. The CPS worker is not law enforcement. No. The Child Advocacy Center is not law enforcement. No. Law enforcement is handling the case or the accusations in their own investigation. And you're really here to aid that, but more so to be supportive of a child and a family that finds themselves in your waiting room, whether or not a child has been found abused or not abused.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. When a guardian, a parent, a mom or dad comes in here, some of the information could be shocking to a guardian or a parent. And one of the things that I'm learning and that I've experienced is that perpetrators have a pretty cookie-cutter way of grooming and of covering up their crimes. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've seen in your experience?
We have a slide that we use a lot of times when we do mandated reporting with community members, and we show all these different people who just look very normal, and that is a perpetrator. There's not like big signs typically that, definitely she's a child molester and those type of things. So I think that one thing that they do is they become friends with the parents, and people just really respect them, and they earn that trust from the parents. And, they will buy children things or give them small gifts, things to make children love them and not want to tell.
Yeah, they work hard to be likable.
Yes.
And that can be confusing for a parent that's coming in here, to have someone that they trust and that is not their idea of who a perpetrator is.
Absolutely. I've sat across from many parents who told me, I didn't suspect anything, and they beat themselves up because they just didn't know, and they say, how can I not have known that he was doing this or she was doing this to my child? And, it's just, they don't. It's easy to look back in hindsight and see signs, but it's a lot harder when you're with the person every day and you think you know them and you love them. I've worked here 11 years, and we've had one actual stranger case. So, never have I interviewed a child who actually said it was a stranger, except for one child in 11 years.
Thank you all so much for talking with me today, and more so, just thank you for the work that you're doing. I appreciate it.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Crystal, not only for today, but for your beautiful poems. I love them.
Thank you.
I do. I enjoy them quite a bit.
Thank you.
And thank you for doing this for everyone.
So after the forensic interview, a team of professionals meets to make a decision about the case. What did the child say? Are they safe? What treatment do they need? And how will the team proceed with the investigation? Child Protective Services and law enforcement are on the team, making those assessments based on what the child discloses. I wanted to understand, what does law enforcement do that's different than CPS? What makes these cases different than others? Sergeant Steve Summers invited me on a ride-along to learn about investigations of child abuse. To better understand the model they use called MDIT, Multidisciplinary Investigative Team, that follows a victim-centered approach as opposed to a offender-centered approach.
How are you?
This new law enforcement strategy opened my eyes to the many changes that have been made to the criminal justice system over the years that I personally feel could increase the potential for healing.
So, I'm part of the West Virginia Internet Crimes Against Children's Task Force.
Okay.
and I'm also an FBI task force officer with the West Virginia Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force.
Okay. When a case comes to you, what's the first thing you do? Or tell me about your job.
Once the CPS worker makes a referral to CAC, they also make a referral to the prosecutor's office. And my office is in the prosecutor's office. So those types of referrals, when they get to the victim's advocate, they come to me and evaluate the initial referral. And those range from child-on-child allegations, disclosure to school personnel, and just a very brief synopsis of what the allegations were. And then I go to the forensic interview that's scheduled. And from there, that's really when the investigation can take a fast track.
So when I went to the CAC, the Child Advocacy Center, I was in the forensic room, and you would be the person that would be in the other room watching the interview.
Yes, watching and listening and taking notes.
Okay.
You know, if there's no outside physical appearance of abuse, then we start with the disclosure. I listen to it, evaluate it, and you know, how much detail, dates, times, who, what, where, when, why. And from that information, then we're able to not only determine where I want to take the investigation and what avenues I need to start evaluating, but it also determines, do we need to have counseling, further services? Do we need to have a medical exam? Are there possibly other siblings that need to be interviewed?
Is this how it's done all over West Virginia?
Yes, the process that we follow, or the model that we follow, of course the MDIT, Multidisciplinary Investigative Team, is state mandated. But what makes these investigations so different is we're dealing with traumatized children. And if you approach it like most of law enforcement investigations, they are offender-centered. It's based upon the evidence obtained. It's about the offender's criminal history, everything centered on the offender. Then you run the very high probability of re-traumatizing that child. But in the victim-centered approach, the victim steers the ship, the investigation, where it's going to go.
So, Steve, do you ever investigate a case where CPS is not involved?
Yes, and there's a lot of reasons for it. It could be, you know, a direct complaint to law enforcement, and sometimes CPS gets involved in those. But if it's a central intake received report, or even local received report, if the family of the child is found to be protective, which means they believe what the child says, or they've taken steps to ensure the safety of their child, and the perpetrator is not in the home, then CPS does not get involved. And that becomes a strictly law enforcement and MDIT issue, which the good thing about MDIT and that model is no matter if CPS is involved or not, no matter if the school system's involved or not, it doesn't matter. With MDIT, all these cases come to that team, which means we get the resources of all those agencies that normally would not be involved.
Have you ever had to remove a child?
I have. Yes, I have.
And can you tell me about that?
So there are certain instances where outside of a court order, law enforcement can remove a child from a home. And the circumstances, the officer would have to articulate that there is great risk of bodily injury, serious bodily injury, death, or sexual abuse or assault. And we're granted, even though it's specific within the code, we have great leeway because in law enforcement, each officer is going to view each incident differently, and their experience, their training, their knowledge is going to go into them determining whether or not this child needs removed because it's an exigent circumstance, or call CPS and see if they need to remove. But in those cases that an officer believes that if they don't do something, that this child is at risk for any of those things, injury, death, further abuse, then that officer can remove that child and either petition the court themselves for that child to be placed into state custody temporarily, or have CPS meet them at the office and do the petition themselves. You know, I don't want to, and sometimes that's the misconception for law enforcement, CPS. The goal's not to remove children from a home, from their parents, be it biological, grandparents, whoever that child psychologically needs to be there for them. Whether they're biologically connected or not, the children need those people in their lives. And for me, at least, my goal is to ensure that those people stay in their lives if they're appropriate. So I take great care in making recommendations or for removal, for charging somebody for child neglect, abuse, because I don't want that child not only to be traumatized by what happened, but traumatized because they just lost their mom, their dad, their grandparent, their psychological parent. So I take great care in ensuring that I have all the facts in place before I make a recommendation that I believe is in the best interest of that child.
And that's a lot of what the public or teachers or school personnel, that people just don't see what's happening.
No, and it's easy to happen. You can just outward looking in, you can just see the system is bogged down from the outward. That's the big wheel turning, but it's the small wheels turning in the back that you don't see, and there is a lot going on to ensure that these kids' complaints don't fall through the cracks and that each one of them are investigated to the best of our ability.
Hearing you talk about how there's been a shift between perpetrator-centered investigation versus victim-centered investigation, I've shared, as I'm talking with people, that I am a victim of child sexual abuse, and it took a long time to get my case heard and prosecuted, but I can take a little comfort today knowing that the journey that I went on, there's been a shift in the process. Things have changed, where a victim and a child and a family has more services and there's more compassion. We know more today.
Yes, and no matter how much evidence we have, no matter if we have a confession, it is still victim-centered. Now, a perpetrator needs to be held accountable, but we are always going to place the victim's needs and not re-traumatizing that victim first. And I've had cases like that we've been ready to go to trial, confident on a conviction, but the victim was just not ready. And the victim just couldn't take having to be placed on the stand, being placed on the stand and reliving that trauma. And sometimes we'll take pleas, or the prosecutor will offer pleas in sexual abuse cases, sexual assault cases, that the public and other people not involved just can't understand. But it's because it's in the best interest of the victim.
Sergeant Summers really got me thinking about victim-centered investigations. To heal, you need people in your life to listen and believe. I've had that, and I know the difference it made for me. But what about kids that have had physical injuries? How do they get help? Kids in Mercer County are lucky enough to not have to travel far for a child abuse medical examination. In fact, they can just walk down the hall after their forensic interview to see Tabitha Cox, a child abuse medical evaluator, who can assess their physical wellness following abuse. I felt a profound sense of calm when I met Tabitha. She's the kind of no-nonsense person who gives it to you straight. But she has a competence and peace that lets you know you're in good hands. I want the world to be filled with Tabithas because kids need people like her to let them know their bodies are going to be okay.
What will happen is they'll come here and they'll have a complete comprehensive exam, which is very similar to a well child exam. I do explain to them off the bat that they're not going to get any shots and that nothing's going to hurt. Some photo documentation is obtained, however, which can be a little uncomfortable for the kids, and I have to explain that to them and their parents or caregiver, whoever may be with them that day, what that process is going to entail. But we are very child specific. We talk to the child and figure out what they like and what they're interested in and try to make it as comfortable as possible. One of the big goals behind this is we want to make the child feel like their body is still normal, that they are going to function correctly. We want to make sure that they don't have any kind of infections or any type of injury. So once we rule all that out and the child leaves, I think they have a little bit of ease and a little bit of comfort knowing that everything is okay. Some other things that we obtain, of course, are forensic evidence. We do that with photo documentation, with video documentation, and of course with written documentation. And then if there's anything that I need to address, potentially sexually transmitted infections or maybe even potentially a pregnancy, any type of injury that I can take care of and treat, I'll do that on site.
What are some of the signs and symptoms that you see or that parents and teachers and school personnel should be aware of?
You know, a child can suffer physical and sexual abuse or either or, and the symptoms and signs are very similar. They sort of blur together. And I think when you're with a child every day and you start to understand their mannerisms and their behaviors, you'll be able to notice some red flags. So some things to look out for, some physical things. If there's unexplained injury, that would obviously be a red flag, but watch too to see if that child starts to dress inappropriately. Let's say that it's summertime and it's 85 degrees and they're wearing long sleeves and jeans to cover up a bruise. That could be concerning. More overt signs and symptoms would be if they're complaining of pain in the genitalia, difficulty urinating, swelling, burning, itching, sometimes trouble standing or trouble sitting. These children may sometimes have nightmares, bedwetting. A child that may be potty trained could start to regress and they'll start having accidents or defecating on themselves. Older kids, you might notice that they're having school failure. They are not getting along with their peers. They may try to run away. They may have suicide attempts. But I think when you're in a classroom with a child all the time, you'll start to notice little changes in behavior or you know, little physical symptoms that you may think that doesn't really match up with how this child normally behaves. And so when you see that, you want to be a little more clued in to, could this child be being abused? There's such a high prevalence of physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and so many children deal with it. And I think a lot of times we may turn a blind eye because we're afraid of hurting someone's feelings or getting ourselves in the middle of something, but you know, it's so important to report anything at all that you're concerned with. And then that way the child comes to the Child Advocacy Center and they're comforted, and you know, we do a physical exam, the child leaves feeling safe and healthy, and then hopefully, you know, life can move along in a more normal pattern for each of these children.
After visiting with Tabitha Cox, I headed to the courthouse. This was not my first time in the courtroom. I found myself, after discussing my abuse with an attorney friend of mine, in another courtroom in West Virginia, seeking justice for the crimes committed against me as a child. So I know how much it matters to be heard in that way, to have your case taken that seriously. George Sittler deals with far too many cases of abuse. He's seen cases that were heartbreaking, unsettling, complicated. But he also knows what it means to find justice, or at least fight for it. And it's one of those things that gets him up in the morning, knowing he will do his best for the people who need him. So George, I've been trying to understand this process, and I spent a lot of time with some CPS workers, the Child Advocacy Agency, and I have an understanding of how that side works. Now, when the ball's over in your court, that's dealing with the law, and that's dealing with the investigation and the criminal side of it, which is very different than what the DHHR and the child advocacy agencies are handling. How does that process work?
Well, the prosecutor's office is responsible for representing the DHHR when the DHHR goes to court and asks for services to be put in place or for children to be taken out of the custody of their lawful guardians. That's the prosecutor's job too. Sometimes those cases simply result in a confidential proceeding where remedial measures are taken, services are provided, and the family is reunited. That's certainly the goal of every abuse and neglect proceeding. However, there are cases where the mistreatment is so severe and the consequences are so awful that we have to bring criminal charges as well, and the remedy of reunifying the family is not available. In those cases, specifically in cases of child sexual assault, an indictment is brought, the grand jury returns it, and then there is a criminal prosecution with the goal of putting a parent behind bars. And we do too much of that. Of course, the increase in child abuse cases is tied to the increase in families suffering from substance abuse disorders, where both parents are incapacitated by their addictions. And in many cases like that, children go without food, children go without proper attention, and the only thing to do is to try to incarcerate parents who have inflicted such mistreatment on their children. In my time at the prosecutor's office, we have put dozens of parents in prison for their mistreatment of their children. And it's never an easy thing to do. Juries don't like to believe that parents will inflict that kind of mistreatment on children that they're supposed to be supporting. But when it does happen, we're able to do it largely because of the assistance of the infrastructure at the Child Advocacy Center. They make it possible for children to take that very difficult step of getting up on that witness stand and talking about things done to them by the people they respect and love the most, their parents. And it can be a very difficult path, but the trust that is built, the rapport that is built with those children by the workers at the CAC is essential to helping them get up on that stand. We do a lot of sex abuse cases, and you expect that the victims in those cases are always going to be female. We had one that recently went to trial with a boy who was 15 years old and was left in the custody of grandma's boyfriend, a fellow in his early 40s. And he was propositioned for oral sex. Money was offered to him, pornography was shown to him, all right after he got up, right after you would expect, somebody in a position of trust would give you breakfast. Instead of breakfast, he got a pornography show and an offer for oral sex. And we put that person in the position of trust in prison for 20 years because although a 15-year-old boy is curious about that sort of thing, he should never be subjected to that kind of treatment by an adult who's supposed to be caring for him. We've also had cases of horrible physical abuse inflicted on small, vulnerable children where there's been permanent brain damage, there's been blindness that stays with those children forever. They're never going to recover from that. So whenever you have some inkling that something's not right in a home, you should not be in denial. Denial is what empowers abusers. You should go right to law enforcement and make sure that your observations, your concerns are followed up on, because the consequences for children last forever.
I'm trying to understand this system. What happens when a teacher or school personnel suspects that a child is being sexually abused? And first thing is any school personnel or teacher is a mandated reporter, and they need to make that report.
State law requires that actually if they don't make that report, they can be subject to a criminal penalty. If it's a sexual assault allegation, it can be up to $10,000 and up to 90 days in jail. Now, of course, most of the time, a prosecutor's office is going to be reluctant to file criminal charges against a teacher who in good faith is making an effort to bring this to the attention of law enforcement. While there is a state child abuse hotline that they can leave a message with, it's also always a good idea to call the 911 center, explain that you have a situation that needs some attention from law enforcement that involves a child, and leave your number so the 911 center can forward it to a law enforcement agency, which will assign an officer, and they'll get back to you and make a preliminary investigation. Every county is required to have a multidisciplinary investigative team, which usually meets monthly. That team includes representatives from the Child Advocacy Center, representatives from the Department of Health and Human Resources, and law enforcement officials from the participating agencies in that jurisdiction, as well as the prosecuting attorney's office. That team regularly reviews these cases and makes determinations about the appropriate remedy for the investigation. Should there be a CPS referral? Should there be services put in place for the child and the family? Should an abuse and neglect petition be filed? And should criminal charges be filed? That determination is made every month in every jurisdiction in Mercer County, every jurisdiction in West Virginia.
So how many of these mandated reporters not reporting cases have you prosecuted?
I've never prosecuted one, but the law provides that it's available. And where this, of course, would happen is if something was reported, or something was reported to somebody who was mandated, it didn't get followed up on, and then that child suffered some harm, was killed, or was repeatedly sexually abused after a report. If an egregious situation like that arose, certainly a prosecutor would be under a lot of pressure to bring charges against somebody who should have gone to law enforcement.
If a child confides in you, not only is it the right thing to do, it's the law to report it.
Absolutely.
Maybe a prosecution feels like the end, and it is the end in its way. But it doesn't mean that the effects of the abuse are over, or that you can put it all behind you. I know that reality all too well. After my stepfather was prosecuted, I was still left with the pain and anger that I had felt for so long. And I sat with that pain until one day, a trusted mentor of mine suggested I get help for the trauma I had experienced. I didn't know that there was specialized treatment for trauma, and I certainly didn't know the way my experience of abuse was still playing out for me as an adult. But then I got the kind of specialized help that I needed. I learned new coping mechanisms. I got sober and centered and discovered a new way of being me in the world. What would it have meant for me if I'd had that much help earlier, when I was a child? How would my ideas about myself and the world have been different? Twyla Hirschman works with kids every day on their journey to healing. She gets that trauma is a thing that happens to you, but that it doesn't have to define who you are.
This is kind of the last stop for children who come through our advocacy center here. As you're aware, they've already had a forensic interview most often. Many times they've had one or more interactions with the family advocate. They may have had a medical exam with our SANE nurse here. And when they come to therapy, I like to think of that as coming through a gateway to help with getting on with their lives. You know, they're here because they've had an interruption that no child should ever have, regardless of what trauma, what kind of trauma it might have been. So they come here to hopefully begin the real business of healing so that they can get on with life. One of the things that you so often see with a child who has been abused, and this is particularly true with sexual abuse, is they come carrying a burden of shame that does not rightfully belong to them. They've done nothing wrong, They're the person who has been harmed, not the person who caused the harm. But they do often talk about feeling ashamed and talk about feeling responsible and what could I have done differently if I hadn't gone to Uncle Joe's that evening, or, you know, whatever it might be. One little boy that I worked with always stands out in my mind as having had more of that burden on his tiny little shoulders than any child should ever have to carry. And we were about probably a third of the way through our therapy, and often I'll do a recap at the beginning of a session. What have you learned so far? What skills do you have? What can you do now that you couldn't do when you first came in here? And he just looked at me very directly and he said, well, I've learned that it ain't my fault. And that was just a glorious moment for him. He had much more work to do, but already he was able to verbalize that he had let go of that feeling of responsibility, that he somehow caused what happened to him to happen.
And without therapy or support, a child could be carrying that burden all the way into adulthood.
They often do, unfortunately, if they don't have some help with healing and much encouragement, much support along the way. And I can say that from experience. At one point in my life, I worked almost exclusively with adults, and I met many who revealed in therapy for the first time that they had been abused as children. So yes, many times without intervention, they do carry that well into adulthood.
I've been hearing that there's a certain healing technique that is used here. It's an acronym. I'm sorry, I've got so many running through my head.
I'm guessing you're thinking about TFCBT.
Yes, tell me about
which is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy.
This particular therapy has been proven to help children heal. Correct. And anyone that's found themselves you know, in any trauma, whether that's sexual abuse or witnessing domestic violence or physical abuse or neglect, there's a healing process that needs to go on. And so what I'm hearing also is that we can heal.
We can heal, yes.
And that just because something a child has experienced a trauma, there's ways to move on through that.
There are ways to move on, yes, and there are also ways to measure how much a particular child has moved on. When I say that it's an evidence-based therapy that we use here, that's one of the hallmarks of an evidence-based therapy, is that you have a means to measure your results. So we have testing instruments. I don't really like the word test because that implies that you're either right or you're wrong, but let me say psychological tests or indices that we can use for a child at the beginning of therapy to measure where they're functioning. That same instrument can be used again at intervals during the therapy and toward the conclusion to measure how much progress the child has made toward healing.
One of the things that I'm learning about this agency is that it's open to everyone, regardless of income.
Absolutely, yes.
And so you're serving a variety of socioeconomic situations with the child.
Yes.
And poverty certainly is one of them.
Yes, yes. Many of the children that we see are disadvantaged, and that presents a challenge often because parents or caregivers may not have resources to transport them for appointments and whatever. So that's one of the ways that the services overlap. Our family advocate often helps to find transportation resources for those families. And again, we all know that a child living in poverty has that extra obstacle to overcome anyway.
What about the children that are LGBTQ, or what about children of color that find themselves? Do they have a special vulnerability? You have to forgive me, I'm not sure if I'm asking the question right, but I'm wondering about how this agency in your office serves all the children.
Well, we do make every effort to be all-inclusive and to serve each child to the best of our ability, regardless of who that child might be or what their trauma might have been. Those children, those special groups that you mentioned, do sometimes have an additional vulnerability because you might think of them as marginalized groups or as having an additional challenge to deal with. Anything that makes us more visible in the crowd or is a bit different than the mainstream can be something that unfortunately sometimes is targeted as a difference and gives a child an extra obstacle to overcome in their path to healing.
So Twyla, I'm learning the process, and I know that when a teacher or a school personnel or any mandated reporter calls and makes the initial report, then sometimes they're unaware of the process that's going on behind the scenes or what's happening from that initial report. Do you have some suggestions for those that have made that call and are just patiently waiting to find out what's going to happen because they may not?
Well, that is a hard position to be in terms of wanting to know or needing to know. But certainly what a teacher or a school staff member, anyone who makes a report, can do is to continue to support and encourage that child. I can't stress enough how important that is for every child. They need adults in their life, and especially those children who may not have a consistent adult. You know, often we see children here who have been in foster care, maybe in more than one foster home, but if they're fortunate enough to be in the same school all year, they have that classroom teacher who's a steady and consistent presence. And that person's presence and support it's boundless in how worthwhile it is to that child. It helps to build resiliency. It helps that child learn to trust. And that's huge because trust is broken when a child is abused, and that has to be rebuilt. Any adult who is consistent and present and caring day to day is a wonderful resource for a child as far as moving their healing process forward. So
teachers and school personnel, mandated reporter, keep doing what you're doing.
Exactly.
Keep caring about the kids.
Exactly.
And that will make a difference.
Absolutely. That is what makes the difference.
Thank you, Twyla.
Thank you.
So much.
It's very nice to meet you, Crystal.
I'm full of so much hope. I know that the system is not perfect, but the system in place today would have made a huge difference in my life as a child and a teenager. Everyone seemed to understand my sexual abuse experience. That wasn't easy. Sharing that I was asking questions from a place of experience. I wasn't sure how people would react. I never am. But I learned from Sergeant Summers that the system has changed. It understands a victim-centered approach. And as I navigated my way through these days, I could feel that. The system today provides wraparound services, counseling, and accountability. Children, families, and so many adults have resources and tools that can change the way a child deals with trauma. This gives me so much hope. It was hard, coming face to face with the statistics and hearing some of the stories. But when I walked into the school, I remembered how much joy school gave me, and that it was a safe place. I know that many children across West Virginia are feeling safe at school, just as I did. I'm honored to work on this project and know that because of this video, school personnel and other mandated reporters will know what to do if they ever suspect a child is being abused or if a child discloses abuse to them. There are many professionals behind the scenes working their hardest to ensure safety and hope and healing. There were some heavy moments for me. I was grateful that the Child Advocacy Center staff understood my feelings and that we could take breaks when things felt a little too heavy. I know this must be the same compassion and care they are giving children and families. And there was laughter too. Joy is important. I call it gratitude. And I'm grateful for everyone doing this work, for the people that hear these stories but keep a smile, because a child deserves a smile. It's comfort when they need it. I'll never forget Vonna, the cafeteria worker, who said she always has a smile for her kids. My lunch lady had that same smile for me, and it made all the difference.